So welcome everybody to the final talk of the day. It's our panel. Earlier, when we started off today, we were talking about, different vulnerabilities that we might find within like the different packages and things from, whether that's like Python libraries and things like that. Um, One of the things I want to talk about with that is with like GitHub specifically. Like, and you have like all these different like, applications out there on GitHub, and they're all tied to different libraries, etc. I know a lot of bug bounty hunters who are really specifically just going through GitHub and downloading a lot of these different applications and spinning them up. And that's kind of like how they're finding vulnerabilities within a lot of, I would say, not necessarily open source tools and things like that, but from organizations like smaller organizations who are running like different applications and things like that. Do you guys see that as a way to help keep things more secure, just from like that bug bounty perspective of like you have like this whole entire community who's out there scanning through all this different code that's out there available on GitHub, finding issues and reporting those, hopefully?
I think so that kind of goes the difference between a bug bounty hunter and like I don't want to say penetration tester because that's not quite accurate, but somebody that is actually doing full analysis of a product. All right. So one of the things that we've taught for years is if you're doing analysis of a product, let's say you have a web app or you have some code that you're looking at. Once again, that code is not just the code that is written. It is incorporating a whole bunch of libraries that make up that particular project. So a good kind of reverse engineer or product penetration tester won't just scan for vulnerabilities in the code, but you'll actually go through and look at the third-party components that make up that project and go through the issue tracker. And if you start going through the issue tracker and someone's like, "Man, as soon as I put in, like this eggplant emoji, the application dies," right? Well, at that particular point, a good pen tester that's doing analysis on that application will be like, if it consistently dies with that particular thing, there may be more that we can actually research in that area. So while I agree that whole bug bounty problem kind of going through and looking at, what is in the code that's in GitHub, I also think that there's more to it. You can go deeper than just scanning the code looking for vulnerabilities. You can get into the point of looking at the issue tracker and what types of crash scenarios are showing up.
Yeah, so looking from the like the bug bounty perspective again, I see that as a way to kind of help keep keeping things more secure, right? Because you have so many people
Oh,
out there who
absolutely.
are looking into these different like vulnerabilities that might exist, right? That's almost like a cheap way to have like a free labor sometimes, not necessarily free. Some organizations might pay if you find a vulnerability, some might not. Some pay a lot of money, some might pay a little. But
Mhm.
you're not having to pay somebody a full-time salary to be on board, be on staff to look at these issues. You rely on the community to help you out with that. So I'm just curious from your guys' perspective
I
what you're seeing on that.
Yeah, anybody else have a take? I have another take on that as well. So
Yeah, it
anyone?
doesn't matter what type of testing I'm doing. I am digging through code, whether it's cloud testing, whether it's
Mm,
AWS, I'm looking in Lambda, whether it's Azure, I'm looking in DevOps, whether it's assume compromise, I'm looking through DLLs, or trying to find the Git interface and register myself so I can look through the code. There's always interesting stuff in code. And so I think we need to make the cultural shift of development with security in mind so that it's not so easy for us to keep finding things everywhere we look.
yeah. Another take about that is look at the fundamental economies of a penetration tester versus somebody that's doing bug bounties, right? If somebody is doing a penetration test, they give you this app and they say, we want you to take this app apart. Like Jordan was talking about, you're going to be digging into the code at some level. If you're a bug bounty person, usually what you're doing is you're trying to find a class or a specific vulnerability, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, something, and then you're going to try to spread that across as many products as you possibly can. So your economic incentive is to find a bug that exists in as many places as possible rather than spending a tremendous amount of time going through and digging through all the possible bugs of one application. And that's just, it's not saying that it's better or worse. I think that there's absolutely value in bug bounty programs. It really helps kind of clear out that low hanging fruit, but understand that that mindset and that economy of like that transaction is fundamentally different than a company that is doing penetration tests.
Sure.
Yeah, and a good example of that type of mentality with a bug bounty hunter is when you have these big vulnerabilities come out, like things like Log4Shell and stuff, right? Where you can easily script some sort of identifier code to easily scrape through a whole swath of targets in a bunch of bug bounty programs and say, here are all of my targets. I found a way to identify if this one thing that actually pays out as a bounty exists. And then I'm going to try to replicate that identification across all of those programs. And then that's how you're really going to make money, right? Is spending time in finding those one things and then trying to blast those and submit those as much as possible.
Yep. And I also think, if we're looking at this, looking at code and looking at all these things, it's fundamentally different whenever you're talking about automated penetration testing platforms, which it's kind of cool. Pantera, I don't know if they're targeting their marketing for me, but they're no longer saying, hey, we are a full pen testing automation. You don't need to hire a pen test. It's basically a pen test enablement product where it can do a lot of those automation things that we do. It's kind of like a more in-depth vulnerability scanner that's kind of speeding us through that process. And the thing I want to get across, like what we're talking about with Tim, Chris, and myself, all of these are fundamentally different approaches. And I think that it goes back to what Tim was talking about when I first joined. I think Tim was the one that was saying it, is it really boils down to what is the company and the customer actually looking to get out of it, right? If you want that in-depth of what you're doing, take this application apart, you're going to want a pen test. If you want to have a horde of people, like Zach was talking about, just trying to find that low-hanging fruit before the attackers do, you're going to want a bug bounty program. If you want to do that adversarial emulation where you're looking across your entire environment for post-exploitation style vulnerabilities, you're going to look at that pen testing enablement type platform. And it's tough because it requires customers to be educated as far as what their specific goals and objectives are.
So I'm always just looking at ways like how do we move forward with secure code, right? How do we, as an industry, get this more front of mind, and how do we get more people involved in thinking about, better practices, better ways to do things? That's a loaded question, I know, but I don't know, like what you, based off of things that you guys have seen, obviously the company buy-in is going to be huge with a lot of things, but is there anything else that we could be doing as a community to help with this?
I think I want to say it was BB King that I saw a post about a while ago, a few months back, and there was a regular dev conference, so it wasn't security focused at all. And I want to say he was highlighting, I think it was Tim Tomes who was there, who was going giving a talk there, a workshop there about secure development and how to hack web apps and stuff like that, and getting that sort of a conversation where it's not a security summit, right? This is called Secure Code Summit. It's put on by us. We are a security group. We try to tilt the conversation towards security all the time here. But those conferences and those events that are small local things or virtual things that are more lean towards development work or more lean towards system administrative work, having a talk peppered in there that just talks about security for that topic can really help spread that mindset, because we already know that universities and colleges are far behind the curve to change their curriculum whenever anything comes up, right? And once you're out of the university, you're not going to get exposed to if they update their course material like 4 years later, right? That's not you're not going to go back for another degree in the same thing. So I think those local events like that are great opportunities to get a security talk jammed in there and get exposure.
I want to bring up a topic of paved paths, because I think that's one thing we can improve security overall. And it's applicable at different levels. On one hand, let's say I ran a pen test within my company on some product. I get a report back. There's almost like two levels of fixing. One is, let's fix this immediate thing if it's a real finding that could affect my product. But there's also should be thinking at the level beyond that, which is, how can I address this class of issues across all the future functionality, all the past functionality that might not have been identified by the pen test? What can I do to close this issue systematically? And the same thinking can be applied to open source libraries, for example. Companies do this internally all the time, this idea of paved paths. It's not easy to do, but it's important work. But we can also apply it and like look at the open source libraries. And internet is built on open source. Like majority of like probably 80% of all the code that's running, it's open source. And so going out there and establishing those paved paths, like secure ways of doing things that are scalable, applicable across multiple companies, multiple products, etc., that's the way to scale security programs.
I'm kind of jaded. I want to kind of jump in. I think it's very rare for an organization to actually come and say, you know what, we're going to try to do everything right, especially if they have a lot of legacy code associated with their history. We do see companies that are starting up new things and they want to do it right. They want to do it right. But we go back to that legacy code. We go back to the legacy web apps. We go back to the products. I mean, if you look at a lot of these different corporations that are doing SaaS or they're providing products to end users and there's multiple products in that company's library, that's a nightmare because you're looking at that history and then you're looking at maintenance of all those versions of all those products. And that's really why a lot of these companies are moving to a SaaS model where they no longer have to support 150 versions. They can support the current version that is in the cloud. And I completely empathize with that. However, the jaded part comes from this. I recently had the opportunity to interview a CTO for a company that I'm not going to say who they are. They had a vulnerability, and it was a stupid vulnerability that showed up in one of their applications. And it's easy for people in the community to be like, well, that is so dumb. How did they miss it? I can understand how it was missed. And in this interview, I asked the CTO, what are you doing with your development practices tomorrow that you weren't doing a week ago before this vulnerability was released to the public? And he struggled with that answer. And I empathize, right? Because he had such a huge product portfolio of legacy software that it becomes almost impossible to deal with that, right? And it's easy for me as the owner of a penetration testing company to say, you know what you need to do? You need to hire BHIS and we'll just come in and pen test your stuff with a blank check. We've got you covered. And to be fair, there are companies that would happily do that, but it's a difficult thing. More often than not, what I see in companies that have a very large code footprint, legacy code footprint in particular, is a similar case to one of our customers that I went and visited. She just became a CTO of a company that had a massive legacy code footprint. And it was bad. BHIS started looking at all of these different applications. And to give you an idea how bad it was, in Microsoft Access, you can publish a web app for that Access database. They had dozens and dozens of critical apps that were Access published websites, right? And if you don't know, that's really, really, really bad. And I flew out there because I was visiting a couple of other customers in that specific area. And I remember sitting and having a conversation with her because I just got done having a conversation with all of their developers and all of their business owners, all the data owners. And everything that we talked about on the security team, her security team and me representing the pen test team, everything was pushback, right? It was like, hey, you guys have got to kill all of these Access database, like published web apps. You can't do this. And they're like, well, this is the way we've been doing it since 1999. And I'm like, clearly it is, but this is something that's going to be catastrophic for you. And then even the apps that they were working on that had active development were riddled with security vulnerabilities. And talking with those developers, just like you were just saying about, how do we kill this class of vulnerabilities moving forward? They weren't even at that point, right? They weren't even close to that particular point. Just basic security practices like NoSQL injection using parameterized stored procedures was well beyond the mind space of this particular customer. And I remember sitting in the room after all of the devs left, after all of the other people left. It was just me and her. And I remember she looked at me and she was very gaunt and she was like, what the hell do I do? They're talking hundreds of applications with thousands of critical vulnerabilities, and there was no support from the rest of the C-Os. There was no support for the developers. And I said, the only thing that's going to change this organization is a massive data breach. She asked me an honest question. I gave her an honest answer. I said, you're here. I recommend you put in your tenure, pray to God on a very regular basis that you don't get popped while you're here. And in a year, go find a CISO position in an organization that gets it. in the way of computer security. That is a really long way to say that many of these organizations that are listening to this webcast were preaching to the choir. Many more organizations, they will not make that jump until they have a catastrophic security vulnerability that they have to deal with that's going to force that culture change. And I think that that's unfortunate, but I think that that's the more realistic path for many organizations.
I believe I tested that organization. And
Everybody, I think,
my
tested that
theory is
organization.
that the culture there is driven by the value derived from development. They make money on applications. Thus, they trust that their devs can use bad passwords and code with poor practices because they drive the revenue at the company. And there's no support anywhere else.
Yeah.
Yep. And anything that would go back and fix that code was a cost center. New apps and new things being developed was driving revenue. 100% correct. And if you remember, Jordan, when this company came back, I think the next time we no bid because we did not want to be associated with the company. We want to do cool shit with cool people. We don't want to be working with companies that honestly don't want to do the right thing because that can be a really bad mark on our name as well.
Yeah, I've seen that before. I want to give a little bit of kudos to the organizations out there that actually do recognize that they're running some super old stuff and they're making efforts to fix things or rewrite things. I know I came into an organization, and it wasn't long ago. I came into an organization where they were running a huge revenue stream for a web app was completely built on a Flash web application that was a proof of concept. So super old code slapped together, sales team got contracts signed, dev team put something in front of them, and then they just started building money. And they just left it there until Flash was being killed with fire. And they sat there and said, well, we could try to fix things or we could try to rewrite it in a modern framework. And then there were two efforts going on. There was maintenance of that old legacy code to try to just keep it up until the new thing was working. And then over a year-long effort to try to build a new thing to replace it while that framework died. And one of the really interesting things that occurred was they had to keep rotating devs off of supporting that legacy code because no dev wants to spend a year of their career in a dying language, in a dying framework, and then write that on their resume when they leave and say, yeah, I'm looking for a new job, but I've spent a year working in something that nobody uses anymore and is being killed off. Like that doesn't help them. So they found a problem with finding human resources to work those old systems while working on a whole new thing for over a year to replace it.
And, kind of to springboard on that, I talked about SAAS. I do think that SAAS solves a lot of these problems, but in one specific, very specific scenario, and that's very large companies, right? Like if you're running Office 365, if you're running Azure, if you're running Intune, if you're running any of these things, I think that you're in an ecosystem that's going to be a better security posture moving forward. And yes, we still find security vulnerabilities in those things, but where I get really bent out of shape, right, is like the Jordan, you remember the whole Amazon auto-scaling Hue thing that you discovered? Where people are running these stacks of software packages in the cloud, and all of these vulnerabilities were still running into the exact same problem of this legacy code base that never gets addressed, that never gets updated. And in some ways, I think it's even worse because it's so easy to start up these stacks and people don't understand how they work at all. And once again, I love all of this. I want to make it very clear that this is all job security and we greatly appreciate it. And for every developer out there that doesn't want to update their code, we have Christmas cards for you. They're in the mail. But seriously, it is a problem, and it kind of goes back to the comic books, right, Zach? I had to write like a thing for the intro of the comic book, and the future is, and it's like these telnet vulnerabilities that we have today we're going to be seeing those vulnerabilities 50 years from now. There's going to be more of them because the amount of legacy code continues to explode out there. The stuff isn't going away. There's no way this is going to be fixed anytime soon.
And
So the best thing you can do is keep your house in order. Yeah, Jordan.
yeah, the 30-second quip on what John just mentioned. That was EMR, so Elastic MapReduce. When you deploy it on AWS or Azure or Google, at one point in that code, it would simply spin up a front end that was waiting for you to configure an admin user. Because of the code pipeline processes and the back end of the cluster not running antivirus, we could just tell it to run Meterpreter shells for us. And then eventually the entire cluster would rain shells on us until the entire cluster is infected.
And standing up that EMR stack was one click in Amazon. The deployment was stupid easy, right?
And if you remember, the customer responsibility model exists above this line, and they don't care what's going on under the hood. It's your problem.
Yep. And I think that gets back to something Tim mentioned this morning with the abstraction. We keep getting further and further and further abstracted. It's basically like, some of the early fathers of like Fortran were all mad about it. They're like, well, hell, now anyone can code. When it was assembly, you had to know what you were doing. And I hate to say, I think those guys were right. It just got easier and easier to write really, really crappy code. It's kind of, what was it? Hal Pomerantz has this quote about Perl versus Python, right? And he said, the one thing that's awesome about Perl is if somebody writes really crappy Perl, it looks like really crappy Perl. If somebody writes really crappy Python, it looks formatted beautifully. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing in the secure code space is there's so many ways to write really, really bad, but functional code. And those things are just being compounded as time goes on.
Well, and another thing from my perspective is with all these abstractions and stuff, we're able to do it faster. And faster is not the route we actually need to go. And so because when we're going fast, it forces us to skip over specific thought processes because either they're ingrained in us or we just didn't know we even needed to think about that. And so, it's like we got all these high level languages and various things like that, but it's just the sheer speed in which the speed of business, whatever that is for your organization or whatever that's driving this stuff, these deadlines and sprints for you agile people. I mean, fragile. But I'm not sure what the technical term there is. But it's like we going back to the assembly days and stuff like that. You had to sit down and do this. Like you had to really, truly think about this and think about some of the ramifications of these decisions. Now it's so abstracted away that we just like I need the smart sand to do this. And however we tell it, I mean, it's in some cases, like if you look at the advent of, generative AI and stuff like ChatGPT and stuff, it's just like, can you learn stuff from these paradigms stuff? Absolutely. But sometimes having access to the information that we're wanting so fast, it causes us to skip over the actual learning process on why this could be a potential issue. I know last year I wrote a remote code execution vulnerability into my flight software for my satellites. It was a very humbling moment.
For a class.
For a class. It
was intentional. It was for a class.
Well, I will tell you, it was based off of a actual solution that flew in space. They have since corrected it. But in the process, I had my statement of work that says, I need this code to do this. I solved the problem. It worked perfectly for that problem. But the difference between like good code and great code, from my perspective, is good code does what you tell it to. Great code only does what you tell it to. Woke up 2:00 in the morning laughing. My wife's like, what the heck is wrong with you? And I'm like, I think I have an RCE in my satellite code. She's like, that's nice, dear. Go to sleep. Woke up the next morning. Sure enough, got in my office, got everything set up, issued the command that I thought was vulnerable, got back 2 responses. The one that I was expecting from the packet, the next one I got root. What happened?
You really started laughing?
I'm a security professional. At that point, I've been doing it for 11 years, and I wrote a remote code execution vulnerability. Why? Because I was moving too fast. I didn't slow down to actually think about what I was doing. I was checking those checkboxes, those Jira tickets. This software needs to do X. This software needs to do Y. Ship it.
How many people listening, I guess how many people on here have been on dev teams, been in those Scrum meetings with product managers and professional certified Scrum masters pressuring you to say, well, do you really think that story point will take that long, or this will take this much effort? Can you get it done faster? And they strip everything out of those story descriptions and qualifications to say something is actually done, down to the bare minimum functional code. And then they say everything else is tech debt. All those other fancy things you want to do to make it the right way, we'll put that in the backlog. We'll get to it in 6 to 20 years. And I know this because I used to just do straight QA for web apps for many years. I'd write automation, functional testing, and things like that, and script that stuff. And I did it for large government projects and small government projects. And maybe like a year or so ago, I got a message from somebody from a project that's still going that I worked on like 8 years ago. And they said, hey, I came across this issue you found that's still in our backlog and still unresolved that you filed 8 years ago. It's like, yeah, it sounds about right.
Wow.
We had a question come in here. I don't know if we could probably answer it, but do anybody here on the panel believe that CISA's Secure by Design pledge would make security vendors accountable on shipping out secure SaaS solutions?
Nope.
Nope. Right away. Nope. Not going to happen. Right. That's fair.
Sorry. I don't.
Right.
Just.
It's a simple no. Yeah. That's it.
And
no period.
Until it starts resulting in 9-figure fines. No.
Tim said accountability. There's no accountability, right? Organizations are not being held to the fire, not in a meaningful way. Organizations keep getting burned to the ground, but nothing happens, right? They just go back to doing business. Some organizations get compromised and their stock price goes up. It's crazy out there. There's so little accountability, and that I think that term that Tim said just now means accountability. There's none.
Yep.
Yeah, and that word is I was going to point that same thing out. If you start asking if are people going to be held accountable for things now, I think the biggest effort, at least recently, semi-recently, to try to make organizations accountable was the implementation of like GDPR over in the EU, right? And organizations, businesses, they still get fined out the ears year after year after year, and they still just continue to operate, right? Either because they just don't care because it's not costly enough to them, or because they can't operate in any other way and still do business.
Well, and oftentimes the fines are so much cheaper than it would actually cost to do it the right way.
Exactly.
So it's literally just a line item that they plan for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a sunk cost to them in that business term, right? It's money that is just built into the way of doing business.
Boy, this was really cheery.
And a happy new year.
We go back. I want to talk a little bit about that CISA pledge. I just feel like CISA has been like this incredible mixed bag, right? Like I think they've done some really good things, but then they come out and they're like, well, here's the top 75 exploited vulnerabilities, the top 175 vulnerabilities. And I get their hearts in the right place, but then basically companies are like, we just have to fix these vulnerabilities, right? And it's like, no, that wasn't the point. And the secure coding pledge, whatever garbage that is, right? It looks good. We're all going to get together. We're all going to sing Kumbaya, and we're going to roast marshmallows on Velo's burning house in Discord. And, but there's no accountability for it, right? There's none. I just, like I said, I'm very, very jaded, but it's also, I'm very positive, right? Like, this is my career. This is what we do at BHIS. I've come to grips with it. I mean, years ago, we talked about come to the dark side because we've got cookies. And this is a fun space to be. It's what makes security so dynamic and so much fun. But boy, there are times, I know a number of you have been doing this for a long time. I remember talking with Jordan about this a while ago. We've tested a lot of companies, and the number of companies that are like really, really, really solid on security is not that many, right? And sometimes you just get terrified going anywhere. It's like, I don't know if I want to shop at that place. It's just kind of the world becomes a kind of dark and scary place when you see it.
Do you
See
guys
how
ever
bad.
get do you guys ever get like surprised by some of the organizations that are just extremely secure and just you're
Oh
like not
yeah.
expecting that at all?
We
You're like, oh my
we
gosh.
actually we
Okay.
actually have a Honey Badger award. It's a really, really tacky plaque that we send them. And it literally is, you're a Honey Badger company. You guys are awesome. Um,
I love
I
that.
love those companies.
Thanks for
And
making
I
our life hell.
oh no, and seriously,
Making me
a
feel
sign of
inadequate
success,
for 5 days.
a sign of success in this career, and like the only definition of success that we have as pen testers is making our lives more difficult. I get into arguments with other people about that, but seriously, if our lives get harder, we're doing the right thing. We're moving and trending in the right direction. We should be trying to make our lives harder. I love it. I absolutely love it whenever Dave Kennedy calls me up and he's like, "You guys tested this customer and they just kicked the snot out of us," and then vice versa. I love calling up and saying, Secure Ideas or Red Siege, like, you guys did a really good job at this company because they locked things down quite a bit. And we're seeing that more and more. So I think there's definitely some forward progress that's being made. But I just go back to, like, there's so many companies out there. And I know that BHIS, Trusted Sec, Red Siege, like, they're very much, we get the pointy end of the spear. We don't get a lot of customers who are like, we want the cheapest web app pen test possible. These guys over here are going to do it for $250. Can you guys beat that? It's like, no, we produce quality. We don't compete with cheap, because we know it's just a matter of time before those companies get popped.
Yeah, I think I saw something from Jake Williams not long ago on Twitter, like a week or two back, of him talking about that same sort of idea, John. It's dealing with customers who might come in and have that initial conversation before the engagement, and they'll say, yeah, for 2-3 years we were pen tested with X pen test firm and they were terrible, their reports were bad, and this has been a bad experience, so now we're coming to you. And I've had those conversations too with people, coming to us. It's sometimes they share the name of that past org, sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
But I like hearing it when people come and they're on the phone with me and they say we're looking for something better, because that means that organization is
Or different.
Yeah, or different.
Yeah, they want somebody at that skill that's going to look at it from new eyes, right? And that's where we're coming from.
Well, some of my favorite
as we're getting
clients.
ready to close things out here, just want to put this question to the panel. What do you guys do when you come across these companies who do have their stuff together, and you're like, at a personal level, like, kind of, I think it was Chris that kind of mentioned, like, you feel defeated, you feel like you
No,
don't know what the heck you're doing, right? But I think there's
I,
a lot of people out there, John, who have that kind of feeling of, oh my gosh, I just went through this test and I didn't find anything. That means I
I,
suck.
I think that that's a tester maturity thing. Um, like, if we have new testers that are in the company, you all know who you are and who you were. Whenever you get your ass kicked, you're on the phone with me and you're like, I sucked, I didn't do anything. But then you get like the jaded old testers like Jordan here. um, Jordan has absolutely no problem saying these guys, or Dale is another good example, that just like, these guys kicked my ass. They did a great job and they sleep well at night.
And this is when
And,
new tools and theories and ideas and techniques are born, when we are forced to reach deeper and into things like
Yeah.
code and DLLs.
Yeah.
And
I like it when you run up against something, if you've spent a while and you're like, I've tried everything I usually try, right? And you're not getting the usual traction that you are, because I love going into our testers chat group and saying, hey, these guys seem to have their stuff together and the usual stuff isn't working. So here's the scenario, here's what they have going on and working in their environment. Does anybody have things that maybe I haven't tried? Anything that you've seen happen on tests that maybe is out of the norm, right? And then you start learning new stuff. That's
when it gets fun. And that's when it gets fun. And that's when it's cool. I do have one quick thing before we wrap it up, Zach. I've got something special. I've been coming and going in and out. What I have in my hands is the first draft of the new class of cards for competitive backdoors and breaches.
Nice.
So I'm getting ready. It's a big, thick stack of them. I'm going to tear them apart. Just plain old black and white, but it's a new class of cards. And this will be going to the content community team for play testing here today. So I'm really, really, really excited about it. It's the first 54 new cards that we're going to be play testing, and it's going to completely change the nature of the game. For those of you that are into games, it's going to be Backdoors and Breaches kind of merged with Here to Slay / Dominion, where we have certain prep cards that the game is going to be much more of a collectible card game, like Magic the Gathering or something like that moving forward. So just so you know, it's draft is done. Competitive. Oh, it's so
that.
cool.
There's going to be tournaments then, right? That's what that means. We're going to have virtual tournaments. We're going to bring it. It's going to be great.
And you're only going to be able to bring 20 cards. So you're going to build your deck to the strongest deck that you can coming into the tournaments. And then we're going to play for cards and keys. I might be missing something there. But no, I just want to say thanks. And sorry I kept jumping out because I'm excited about getting this out to the content community team.
All good. All good. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're at the top of the hour. So huge shout out to all of the speakers and presenters who joined us today, shared their wealth of knowledge with us. We appreciate you all so much. Thank you to all of the attendees as well who took time out of their lives to be here with us. We greatly appreciate you. We could not do this without you. So thank you so much for your time. And of course, thank you to everybody on the panel who joined us this morning and this afternoon and helped make this a better event. Thank you guys so much for being here. And a special shout out to Barricade Cyber Solutions for sponsoring this event as well. And please be sure to check out Wild West Hackin' Fest coming up in Denver, February 2025. It's going to be a great time. I think just about everybody on this panel is going to be there. So we would really look forward to seeing you there. And we'll see you next week for our next Anticast. Thank you all again so much for being here. We hope you have a great week and take care. See y'all later.